On today's episode of China Explained, Xi vows to deepen ties with Putin in a disturbing turn of events. China may no longer be a viable option as the world's factory. And lastly, the CCP scrambling to boost China's fertility rate. But is it too late to take steps in the right direction? Coming up, but before we get into the video, I'll request all of you to like and subscribe. It helps us immensely with the YouTube algorithm. Without any more delays, let's get into today's topics. Two of Putin's closest and probably only allies, Xi and Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, vowed to deepen defense and security ties. Both parties expressed the same views on the war, as discussed during a meeting in Beijing. Lukashenko spoke in support of China's so-called political solution. For those unaware of this complete mockery of the Ukrainian plight that the CCP calls a resolution to resolve the war, allow me to give a brief view into the mind of a power-hungry, egomaniacal dictator. The CCP came up with a 12-point document which states their position on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. The document said that the conflict should be resolved through diplomatic means, which we all agree is an admirable position to have. But this is where the document ceases to make any sense with language such as equal and uniform application of international law should be promoted, while double standards must be rejected, and the security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. All parties must stay rational and exercise restraint, avoid fanning the flames and aggravating tensions. The international community should remain committed to the right approach of promoting talks for peace, helping parties to the conflict open the door to a political settlement as soon as possible, and creating conditions and platforms for the resumption of negotiation. Unilateral sanctions and maximum pressure cannot solve the issue. They only create new problems. China opposes unilateral sanctions unauthorized by the UN Security Council. It is clear to see that, in actuality, it is a thinly veiled criticism of the West. And despite China maintaining that they are neutral in this entire conflict, it is clear that China has allied itself with Russia through its actions or statements such as these, which are intended to safeguard Xi's and Putin's interests at the cost of innocent Ukrainian lives and their national sovereignty. Returning to the Beijing conference, Xi and Lukashenko expressed deep concern over the prolonged armed conflict. They looked forward to an early return to peace in Ukraine, according to a joint statement following their sit-down in the Great Hall of the People. But like the previously mentioned document, his true motivation is not to return peace in Ukraine, but to return the peace in the region on his and his allies' terms, at the cost of other countries' sovereignty and safety. While speaking about the war, Xi called for relevant countries to stop politicizing and instrumentalizing the world economy, and act in a way to help resolve the crisis peacefully, in an apparent reference to the US and its allies. But in actuality, the ones profiting from this conflict are countries like China, Belarus, and India, continually importing Russian fossil fuels and natural resources at a drastically reduced price, keeping Russia's warmongering economy afloat. To prove my point, a US president touched down in Ukraine to meet with his counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky. China's top diplomat traveled in the opposite direction on his way to Russia. As the US and its allies work towards stepping up military aid and support for Ukraine in these trying times, China, on the contrary, is providing support by repeating Russian propaganda and disinformation about the war, opposing economic sanctions against Russia, and abstaining or sided with Russia in United Nations votes on the war in Ukraine. China went as far as to allow the Kremlin to use the Chinese yuan as a replacement for the US dollar, and use the Chinese alternative to SWIFT after the sanctions. And it is not just me who believes that China is working with Russia despite their neutral claims. In a statement to CNN, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said, "We need more proof that China isn't working with Russia, and we aren't seeing that now." But in the usual wolf warrior fashion, the CCP did everything to shift the blame onto the US. At a regular news conference, a ministry spokesperson said, "It is the US side, not the Chinese side, that supplies a steady stream of weapons to the battlefield. The US side is not qualified to lecture China, and we would never accept the US dictating or coercing pressure on Sino-Russian relations." See, it is one thing to safeguard one's national interest. Still, when you are actively funding a tyrannical regime and giving them aid to commit war crimes and violate another country's sovereignty when the country you are aiding is the aggressor, you have no right to shift the blame onto other countries. But I hypothesize that China is taking notes from this war for when it attacks Taiwan while also securing an ally in a world of dwindling Chinese support. Before we discuss the steps CCP is taking to tackle the population decline, let's take a few minutes to talk about why China might no longer be viable as the factory of the world. After the curbs the US put on China to advance technology, it is slowly reducing the viability of China as the manufacturing base for exports, according to Hideo Tanimoto, the president of a company that is an integral part of the chip supply chain. This assessment comes as he leads an aggressive investment strategy for Kyocera, including constructing its first factory in Japan in nearly 2 decades. Tanimoto told the Financial Times in a statement that the model that the company is currently abiding by only works if the products made in China are sold in China, but the business of producing in China and exporting abroad no longer works. He said, "Not only have wages gone up, but with all that's happening between the US and China, it's difficult to export from China to some regions." In October of last year, the US announced export controls of high-end semiconductors and their manufacturing equipment, and which severely hampered China's capability of delivering cutting-edge technology. If you want to know more about the export controls, click the link in the description below, where we discuss this and more in a previous video. But the TLDR of the story is that this control measure resulted in Japan and the Netherlands restricting the export of chips and their manufacturing tools to China. Multiple companies have moved or are currently moving from China, such as Apple, Nike, Adidas, and Samsung. And Kyocera has been added to the growing list. Kyocera's products include phones, printers, and solar panels. The company holds a 70% global market share in ceramic components for chip manufacturing equipment. Tanimoto said U.S. export controls were part of why Kyocera cut its full-year operating profit forecast this month by 31%. Kyocera has been finding itself in the trade dispute between the US and China and moved to Vietnam in 2019 for manufacturing of its copiers for the US market from China to avoid Trump-era tariffs. But if you think China is the victim here, which I highly doubt you are, as you are watching our channel and you take Chinese propaganda with a grain of salt, but if you think the US is taking these steps to stifle China's growth, I am sorry to tell you this. Still, the real reason is that the United States hopes to stop Beijing from using chips to enhance its military and potentially preempt an invasion of Taiwan, where the vast majority of the world's semiconductors and microprocessors are produced. And if we were to learn anything from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that war is terrible, not just for the people involved, but also for the economy of other countries. And China is hell-bent on waging war against Taiwan. Despite its lofty speeches and documents saying they respect the sovereignty of other countries, they refuse to acknowledge the sovereignty of Taiwan. And not just Taiwan, they also claim the entirety of the South China Sea and parts of India. And suppose you believe that the US is the only reason companies move their manufacturing plants from China. In that case, you again will be sorely mistaken, as countries like Vietnam and India are trying to unseat China in higher-end manufacturing, with iPhone maker Apple and chip makers eyeing its vast lands and young population. Not just that, Vietnam has been undergoing rapid economic reform since 1986, which have yielded significant returns. And not just that, because of the draconian lockdown and the overall deterioration of the Chinese market, previously small players like Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Thailand are now starting to look lucrative and are slowly encroaching on the market once dominated by China. And now, from China's economic woes to its demographic problems. So, for people unaware of China's demographic problems, let me give you a rundown. So, because of the CCP's one-child policy that Chairman Mao implemented to impress the USSR, the birth rates in China suffered. And since people preferred biological male offspring, many a time girls were killed at birth, which eventually led to a very skewed sex ratio. And due to the rapid growth the country has seen, raising a child in China has become much more expensive, so the younger generation has chosen not to have children until later in life, which has left China with a rapidly aging population. To mitigate the problems brought on by the situation in 2015, the CCP introduced the two-child policy and later removed all limitations on the number of children a family could have. But as stated before, people say it is already expensive to raise a single child, and most people can't afford to raise multiple children. The CCP is in deep trouble because of this situation, and is actively trying to nullify the one-child policy's effects. It might be too late to counteract its impacts, as it has left the CCP and the people of China with far too many problems, more than anything mentioned before. Since these problems could not be mitigated quickly, the CCP doesn't have time to avert a catastrophic situation. They are desperately scrambling to come up with new solutions. Proposals have been made for free college education and equal rights for unmarried women by China's top political advisory body to boost the country's birth rate after its population fell last year for the first time in 6 decades. The proposal comes ahead of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, which kicks off on March 4th. The proposal also states that China should remove restrictions on marital status used to register newborns, allowing unmarried women to enjoy fertility services like married women do. Qie Wenmin, a member of China's top political advisory body, told the state-backed Global Times this week. Currently, the CCP rules dictate that only married women are legally allowed to give birth. Still, in some provinces, the rules are starting to change, with China's southwestern Sichuan allowing singles to have children in February. The shrinking population has also led the authorities to make hasty incentives and measures to boost the population, including expanding maternity leave, financial and tax benefits for having children, and housing subsidies. Paternity leave should also be increased to make men share parenting responsibilities, said CPPCC member Gan Huaixian on Wednesday. They have also devised a policy for families with a third child born after 2024 to get a free college education, CPPCC delegate Zhao Dongling said on Thursday, a proposal that was one of the top trending topics on the Chinese social media platform Weibo. But after all the chaos created by the one-child policy, the CCP still fails to understand that adding rash policies will only result in more problems in the future, and restricting people's fundamental human rights will eventually lead to more problems. And even though they are trying to mitigate the problems caused by the one-child policy, their current policies will not backfire on them. Anyway, that's all for today. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider liking and subscribing, and comment below if you have any suggestions. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you. It helps us with the algorithm. Until next time, goodbye.